The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. As long as people have traded for mutual benefit, we've had a problem. How do we take economic value and move it across space and time? Money has been around for thousands of years because it solves that problem. It helps people move economic value. Now, barter or direct exchange is an ancient practice, but it only really works at a small scale. Barter depends on what an economist would call coincidence of wants. I want your apples, you want my shoes, at the same time, in the same place. But the market naturally seeks efficiency by moving toward a larger scale. And the larger the scale of production, the harder it is to find the coincidence of wants for three reasons: conversion, time frame, and location. First, the problem of conversion. Imagine you're a shoemaker who wants to buy a house. Well, it's very hard to buy a house using shoes, because whoever's selling the house probably doesn't want thousands of shoes. That's the conversion problem. The goods you want to sell don't match what your buyer wants in return. Second, the problem of time frame. In this case, imagine you own an apple orchard. You produce apples and you need to buy a truck to take them to market. Now, apples are a perishable good, so it's hard to collect enough apples to trade for that truck before they spoil. You need a way to manage the time frame difference between a perishable good and a durable one. Finally, the problem of location. If you live in City A and you want to move to City B, your house is probably pretty difficult to take with you. So you'll have to sell your home in City A and then buy a different home in City B. That's the location problem, when you want to buy something in a place where you cannot physically take your goods. The way around these problems is to use a medium of exchange, that is, an intermediary good, to facilitate the transaction. That's money. The core function of money is to be that medium of exchange. You convert your goods and services into money, which makes their economic value more easily divisible, storable, and transportable. Once a form of money is adopted as a medium of exchange, it becomes a currency. So you can think of money as the system of value that supports economic activity, and currencies as a specific form of money used in practice. Theoretically, almost any good, as long as the buyer and seller agree, can serve as a currency. But what makes some goods better than others? The preferred goods tend to have a stable, agreed-upon value and a steady supply. At first, we used commodities such as precious metals. But over time, we've found better options, such as the paper and increasingly digital currencies we use today. But beyond being just a medium of exchange, money has two other functions which are key to its unique utility. Money is a unit of account or standard of measurement for the value of goods and services. Just as height can be measured in inches, economic value can be measured in dollars. Effective money is a widely accepted unit of account with an agreed-upon value. That gives us a shared economic language. Finally, money is a store of value. A farmer has a harvested crop right now, but needs to buy seeds the next planting season. Effective money is stable in value over time, so people can store their wealth and purchase goods in the future. These are the three uses of money: as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Now, the type of money we are most familiar with, such as the dollar, or the euro, or the Japanese yen, is government-backed currencies, which are known as fiat currency. Fiat currencies are tools produced by governments to increase economic efficiency. But unlike coins made of precious metals, they do not have intrinsic value. Think about it. The pieces of paper in your wallet are essentially worthless. They only have value because governments say so and because people believe them. Because of this lack of intrinsic value, governments must manage fiat currencies well to maintain people's trust. For example, the 1980s were called the lost decade of Latin America because governments continually printed more and more money. This rapidly increased the inflation rate and ruined their currency's utility. People reverted back to using commodities. For a time in Peru, people were using laundry detergent as money. I saw this during the early days of my business career when I worked in the detergent business. Our trucks in Peru were constantly getting hijacked because the goods inside were a better store of value than the Peruvian currency. So our laundry detergent in practice became a currency, much to the dismay of our truck drivers. That's a major caveat for fiat currencies. If they aren't managed well, they lose their utility as money. Today, there are about 150 government-backed currencies. It's the utility of these currencies that determines their popularity. Subscribe to CSIS and stay tuned for our next episode.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. Over 2,500 years ago, in what is now Turkey, the Lydian Empire made one of the biggest financial innovations in
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. Over 2,500 years ago, in what is now Turkey, the Lydian Empire made one of the biggest financial innovations in history. It created the world's first metal coin, which became the world's first government-issued currency. We've come a long way since then. Today, there are about 150 government-backed currencies in circulation. Which of these currencies we use isn't a decision many of us think about. We generally use the currency issued by the country where we live. What if two traders are in different countries with different currencies? They would need to settle their transaction using currency acceptable to both parties. In other words, this international transaction would need an international currency. So what is an international currency? It's a currency held beyond the borders of the issuing country and used for transactions between non-residents. The US dollar is an international currency. Non-Americans use it to settle cross-border trades. International currencies are used for many purposes. They can serve as a unit of account. Foreign central banks use them to peg the value of their own currency. The Cuban peso is pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate of roughly 24-1. International currencies can also serve as a store of value for governments, firms, and individuals who may use them to store their wealth. Reserve currencies are a common example of this. Those are foreign currencies held in a country's central bank, both as a store of value and to adjust the exchange rate of their own currency. Today, there are about 150 government-backed currencies, yet only a handful of these are truly international currencies, such as the dollar, the euro, and the Japanese yen. What is it that makes these currencies better travelers than others? Well, there are three key factors that drive a currency's international usage. First and foremost is the size of the issuing country's economy and its international trade flows. Countries with a large volume of international transactions naturally issue more useful currencies, as they can be used to buy a wide range of goods and services from that country. In essence, US dollars are valuable because traders can use them to buy so many different products. These products include financial assets as well, such as stocks and bonds. Globally, there is a huge demand for financial assets, which are typically used to store wealth. Investors want a safe place to park their money and earn a return. So international currencies tend to come from countries with large markets that can handle the demand. Second is the development and openness of the issuing country's market. While market size is important, it's just one factor. How a nation's financial markets are regulated is also critical. A a country with efficient financial institutions and laws that reduce barriers to trading likely has a currency that saves investors time and money. The Swiss franc travels well, despite the nation's small size. That's due to the country's well-developed financial sector, solid legal framework, and political stability and neutrality. Market openness, or the ease of access for both citizens and non-citizens, is also important. That increases the range of transactions the currency can be used for. And finally, the third factor is price stability. Remember, a currency is a tool to move economic value across space and time. Its utility relies upon it being a stable store of value. Just think about it. Would you accept something for payment if you had no idea what it was going to be worth tomorrow? Well, governments and traders feel the same way. A currency's price stability is determined by many factors, like domestic inflation and the currency's supply and demand. Others relate to confidence in the country's economy. If a country's institutions lack transparency and credibility, that deters investors who seek a predictable business environment. And as we noted in the Swiss example, political stability plays a role. These are the three main factors that help international currencies travel: economic strength, market openness, and price stability. Subscribe to CSIS and stay tuned for our next episode.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. The US dollar is the primary international currency, a status known as dollar dominance. It's the top reserve currency, the main anchor currency, and is among the top invoicing currencies. Commodities are also, for the most part, priced in dollars. Almost anywhere you go, traders and investors want dollars. But why is that? Why is the dollar dominant? The dollar excels at each of three factors that drive international currency adoption: economic strength, market development and openness, and price stability. Throughout history, the primary international currency has been the one that best meets these criteria. And once a currency is on top, it tends to stay there. Human society has changed dramatically in the last 400 years. But in that time, we've only had three primary international currencies. The first of these was the Dutch guilder. During the Renaissance, the Dutch experimented in many fields, including banking and finance. In 1609, they opened the Bank of Amsterdam, which developed a simple yet revolutionary innovation. It measured the metallic content of coins. At the time, coins from all over the world flowed into Amsterdam and were used for exchange. These coins were minted with precious metals like gold and silver, but the issuing governments would add in cheaper materials like copper and nickel when facing economic trouble, reducing the amount of precious metal in the coin. It was hard to know how much these coins were really worth. The Bank of Amsterdam limited deposits to coins above a certain purity level, thereby standardizing and stabilizing the value of the guilder. The Dutch Republic was also one of the more culturally tolerant states in Europe, and its banks happily offered services to foreigners. The Dutch may not have had the world's largest economy, but they had an uncommonly stable currency and an efficient and open financial system, which drove international adoption of the guilder. Once it was on top, the guilder benefited from network effects, meaning a currency becomes more attractive as more people use it. Just think about it. As more people accepted guilders as payment, guilders became more useful. And the more useful guilders became, the more people accepted them, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. Network effects tend to increase exponentially, creating a huge incumbency advantage. Now you know why those merchants in Rembrandt's paintings were always smiling. Given all this, why aren't we still using guilders? Some questionable decisions by the Dutch authorities in the 18th century eroded confidence in the guilder's price stability. Traders began to look for an alternative just as a major economic shift was underway, the Industrial Revolution, which was led by Britain. Using steam power and other innovations that greatly boosted output, the British Empire quickly became an economic powerhouse. By the early 19th century, Britain was the world's largest economy and commercial power. The pound also benefited from decades of price stability, thanks to effective management and massive gold reserves, along with London's open and well-developed financial system. With this combination of elements, the pound became the primary international currency for over a century. It only lost this position when an even greater economic power emerged: the United States. Back-to-back world wars in the early 20th century caused worldwide destruction, while leaving the U.S. largely intact. This gave the U.S. economy a considerable advantage and attracted traders to the dollar. This economic strength and leadership created institutional advantages for the dollar. For example, in 1944, the Bretton Woods agreements centered the international economic system around the dollar. The dollar became the global reserve currency as foreign central banks agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar, while the dollar was pegged to gold. The Bretton Woods system ended in 1971, but by then the dollar's dominance was solidified. Today, the United States is the world's largest economy, and it's among the world's largest traders. It also has massive, open, and efficient financial markets, and U.S. debt is among the most stable assets in the world. These factors keep the dollar on top. Now, the dollar isn't perfect, but to a trader, it's the least bad option. China trades more than the U.S., but it also has restrictive financial markets that deter investors. The United Kingdom has highly developed and open markets, but it trades much less than the U.S. The euro and the Japanese yen also have limitations. And because the dollar is already on top, it gets the incumbency advantage of network effects. That's why the dollar is dominant. It's the best option for traders and for investors. But, as history has shown, if it stops being the best option, these actors will look elsewhere. Subscribe to Csis and stay tuned for our next episode.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. In the
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. In the 1960s, the French finance minister described the dollar's international prominence as the United States' exorbitant privilege. He had a point. The dollar's status as the world's primary international currency grants significant advantages to the United States. But other observers see dollar dominance as more of a burden than a benefit to the United States. So which is it? Like many situations, it's complicated. For instance, one downside is that to sustain dollar dominance, the United States must allow for some imbalances in its economy, namely high debt levels and large trade deficits. Think about it. For foreigners to use dollars in trade or as reserves, they need to have dollars in the first place. That means huge amounts of dollars must travel overseas. This happens when U.S. residents exchange dollars for other currencies to buy foreign goods. or when the U.S. government or firms in the U.S. issue debt in dollars and sell it to foreign creditors. This isn't all bad. Because foreigners want dollars, there is a strong demand for U.S. debt. In other terms, there are many lenders prepared to loan money to the United States and receive dollars in return. The United States can borrow from these lenders in dollars, likely at lower interest rates than it otherwise would. Imagine 50 banks competing to provide you with a home loan. The interest rate on your mortgage would be lower than if you only had one offer. Just how much lower is hotly debated, but dollar dominance likely leads to easier access to credit for everyone.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. In the 1960s, the French finance minister described the dollar's international provenance as the United States' exorbitant privilege. He had a point. The dollar's status as the world's primary international currency grants significant advantages to the United States. But other observers see dollar dominance as more of a burden than a benefit to the United States. So which is it? Like many situations, it's complicated. For instance, one downside is that to sustain dollar dominance, the United States must allow for some imbalances in its economy, namely high debt levels and large trade deficits. Think about it. For foreigners to use dollars in trade or as reserves, they need to have dollars in the first place. That means huge amounts of dollars must travel overseas. This happens when U.S. residents exchange dollars for other currencies to buy foreign goods, or when the U.S. government or firms in the U.S. issue debt in dollars and sell it to foreign creditors. This isn't all bad. Because foreigners want dollars, there is a strong demand for U.S. debt. In other terms, there are many lenders prepared to loan money to the United States and receive dollars in return. The United States can borrow from these lenders in dollars, likely at lower interest rates than it otherwise would. Imagine 50 banks competing to provide you with a home loan. The interest rate on your mortgage would be lower than if you only had one offer. Just how much lower is hotly debated, but dollar dominance likely leads to easier access to credit for everyone, from the U.S. government to firms to households. This makes it easier to fund everything in the U.S., from infrastructure to education to defense. But there's a downside to this too. Lower cost borrowing may prompt the United States to take on more debt than it otherwise would, contributing to ballooning debt levels. The interest alone on outstanding U.S. debt exceeded $1 billion per day in 2023, and it's only going up. Like I said, it's complicated. Another such trade-off is that dollar dominance leads to a higher exchange rate for the dollar. As demand for dollars goes up, the price of dollars goes up too. Sounds great, right? A strong dollar boosts the power of U.S. foreign aid, including military aid. And American consumers and firms certainly reap the benefits of the dollar's stronger purchasing power when they buy imported goods. However, U.S. firms that compete against these imports or export their own products must cope with this added pressure. Imagine an American shoemaker who wants to sell his shoes to a buyer in Europe for $100. If the exchange rate is €1 for $1.1, then the $100 pair of shoes would cost the buyer about €90. But if the dollar strengthens to a 1-to-1 exchange rate, then the European customer would now pay €100. The dollar value of the shoes didn't change, but the price for the buyer in Europe increased. As the dollar's exchange rate goes up, the price of U.S. exports also goes up. This puts U.S. exporters at a disadvantage compared to countries with less valuable currencies. A strong dollar has been among the many pressures on U.S. manufacturing over the last several decades. Those are some of the economic impacts of dollar dominance, but the most critical consequence may be strictly geopolitical. Dollar dominance allows the United States to impose uniquely powerful financial sanctions. Even though the dollar is used worldwide, almost all dollar payments move through the U.S. banking system. As the United States has legal authority over its banking system, it can bar designated countries, firms, and individuals from using it. Because dollars are so central to international trade and finance, this essentially locks these actors out of the global financial system. You can imagine how disruptive this might be. Several foreign adversaries under U.S. sanctions have seen their economies decline. No other nation has a tool this potent and far-reaching for pursuing its foreign policy objectives. So, is dollar dominance an exorbitant privilege? Well, it's certainly a great responsibility that comes with both benefits and burdens. Experts debate the trade-offs and question how advantageous dollar dominance truly is. The effectiveness of sanctions is also highly controversial. Using sanctions may undermine dollar dominance, as foreigners will naturally seek alternatives. Today, thousands of governments, firms, and individuals are under U.S. sanctions. Accordingly, many nations are dissatisfied with the current dollar-led system and seek to knock the dollar off its throne. Subscribe to Csis and stay tuned for our next episode.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. Risk management is part of everyday life. When you put an umbrella in your bag, leave for work a few minutes early, or look both ways before crossing the street, you're identifying, evaluating, and mitigating risks to achieving your goals. Firms and nations manage risks too, and many view the dollar as increasingly risky. Using the dollar can expose them to U.S. financial sanctions. Some want to hedge against these risks by using other currencies, and they're quite vocal about it. From China to Brazil to even France, there are calls to reduce dependence on the almighty dollar. Is this the beginning of the end of dollar dominance? Not necessarily. Experts largely agree that the dollar will remain dominant for the near future. The dollar retains its primacy because of the unique scale, resilience, and openness of the American economy and its financial markets. No other economy matches this. The dollar also benefits from network effects. The more a currency is used, the more useful it becomes, and the more useful it becomes, the more it's used. This self-reinforcing cycle creates a major incumbency advantage for the dollar. And most importantly, there is no obvious alternative. The dollar doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be the least bad option. And other currencies have their own limitations and risks. Consider the Chinese renminbi, which seems like a natural alternative to the dollar. China is the world's top trader, and China continues to engage in economic relations with sanctioned nations like Russia and North Korea. But the renminbi has serious limitations. China's strong state control creates an unpredictable business environment. The state also limits the flow of renminbi into and out of its economy to control the currency's value, making the renminbi harder to use outside of China. And, unlike other large economies, China's central bank is not independent. Instead, it's controlled by China's political leaders. All that to say, strict state control makes the renminbi less efficient and less reliable as a medium of international exchange. What about the euro? The common European currency is an efficient medium of exchange powered by Europe's massive single market. The Eurozone also has open and well-developed financial markets, with generally transparent and stable regulations. Yet the euro also has risks. Eurozone member states who share the same central bank, yet each member retains autonomy over its fiscal policy. This unified monetary policy, without a unified fiscal policy, can threaten the euro's stability, as seen during the European debt crisis.
And to maintain price stability in euro area and to preserve the euro.
The euro also comes with its own sanctions risks. In the build-up to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia swapped most of its dollars for euros, assuming Europe wouldn't impose strict financial sanctions. Well, Russia quickly learned that this assumption was wrong. The EU froze hundreds of billions of Russian assets stored in European financial institutions. Another political leaders. All that to say, strict state control makes the renminbi less efficient and less reliable as a medium of international exchange. What about the euro? The common European currency is an efficient medium of exchange powered by Europe's massive single market. The Eurozone also has open and well-developed financial markets, with generally transparent and stable regulations. Yet the euro also has risks. Eurozone member states who share the same central bank, yet each member retains autonomy over its fiscal policy. This unified monetary policy, without a unified fiscal policy, can threaten the euro's stability, as seen during the European debt crisis.
And to maintain price stability in euro area and to preserve the euro.
The euro also comes with its own sanctions risks. In the build-up to its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia swapped most of its dollars for euros, assuming Europe wouldn't impose strict financial sanctions. Well, Russia quickly learned that this assumption was wrong. The EU froze hundreds of billions of Russian assets stored in European financial institutions. Another alternative you may have heard of is cryptocurrency. In contrast to fiat currencies backed by governments, cryptocurrencies are decentralized, meaning they're not reliant on any centralized authority to maintain them. For some, this is the appeal of cryptocurrencies. They could offer users privacy and the ability to circumvent government sanctions and oversight. But it should be no surprise that cryptocurrencies come with their own risks and limitations. Traders prefer the dollar because of features like its large market size and stable price. Cryptocurrencies have yet to develop these traits. Few merchants accept cryptocurrency as a medium of exchange, and wildly fluctuating prices undermine its utility as a unit of account and a store of value. And cryptocurrencies may be inherently limited by what experts call the blockchain trilemma, meaning that blockchains, the underlying technology behind many cryptocurrencies, cannot achieve optimal levels of decentralization, security, and scale at the same time. Increasing one usually weakens another. For instance, while payment systems like Visa can process tens of thousands of transactions per second, Bitcoin can only process about 7. This makes crypto impractical for day-to-day use. But to increase transaction speed, the network would need to become more centralized, undermining its key source of appeal in the first place. Some ideas to mitigate the blockchain trilemma have been proposed, but there isn't a silver bullet solution. Until this is resolved, cryptocurrencies are unlikely to replace the dollar. All in all, it seems the concerns about the impending end of dollar dominance are overblown, but it would be unwise to dismiss these worries entirely. While dollar dominance will likely continue in the near term, the long term is much harder to predict. We live in a time of disruptive geopolitical, economic and technological change. And there are emerging forces today that may threaten the dollar's primacy over the next several decades. In our next episode, we'll dive into these long-term threats to dollar dominance. Subscribe to CSIS and stay tuned for our next episode.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. Human civilization has changed drastically over the last 400 years. Yet over that time, there have only been three primary international currencies: the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and the US dollar. Due to the self-reinforcing dynamic of network effects, the top currency tends
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
The US dollar.
I'm Scott Miller, and this is Defending the Dollar. Human civilization has changed drastically over the last 400 years. Yet over that time, there have only been three primary international currencies: the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and the US dollar. Due to the self-reinforcing dynamic of network effects, the top currency tends to remain on top. But the last 400 years also show us that, no matter how entrenched they may appear, dominant international currencies can and do change. After all, there have been three primary currencies, not just one. In the 1700s, economic mismanagement by the Dutch weakened the guilder, just as the Industrial Revolution began to accelerate economic growth in Great Britain. 2 centuries later, financial crisis in the United Kingdom made the pound less attractive to investors, while growth in the United States drove adoption of the dollar. Then World War II exhausted the British economy and the pound, while the dollar and the US, the only industrial economy not destroyed by war, achieved primacy. For both transitions, vulnerabilities in the dominant currency, along with economic and technological trends, slowly opened the door for an alternative until a major event incited the full shift. In Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, a character describes going bankrupt in the same way: gradually, then suddenly. Let's apply this idea to dollar dominance. Which actions appear minor today, but could disrupt the dollar's primacy in the future? Certainly, some relate to financial innovation. New digital payment networks could allow countries to efficiently exchange their local currencies directly, eliminating the need for dollars. Even small improvements could have a tremendous impact. In the energy trade, for instance, margins are so small that a tiny reduction in costs could motivate a switch from dollars to another currency. And digital versions of fiat currencies, known as central bank digital currencies, could also boost transaction efficiency and mitigate some of the issues holding back competitors today. Over 130 countries are exploring central bank digital currencies, while 3 have already launched theirs. If the United States fails to adapt and innovate, competitors could employ new technologies to boost their own currencies and undermine dollar dominance. Another potential factor is U.S. fiscal policy and exploding debt levels. In 2023 alone, the United States spent over $650 billion on interest payments on its debt, and fiscal deficits show no sign of slowing. By 2034, interest payments are projected to more than double, exceeding $1.5 trillion annually. There may come a point when massive U.S. debts undermine the dollar's credibility as a store of value, as investors lose confidence that debts will be repaid. Concern over this very issue prompted Fitch Ratings, one of the big three credit rating agencies, to downgrade the United States' credit rating in 2023. The downgrade itself had minimal market impact. Markets had already incorporated this information into asset prices. But it's a warning that soaring U.S. debt levels will likely become a bigger burden down the road. One last factor to consider is the United States' continued reliance on financial sanctions. Remember, dollars are useful because a lot of people can and do use them. By their very nature, financial sanctions restrict who can use the dollar, thereby undermining its utility. In some cases, this is an acceptable trade-off. Drug traffickers shouldn't be able to use U.S. dollars to finance their operations. But the United States sanctions far more than just traffickers. There are over 12,000 individuals and organizations under financial sanctions by the Treasury Department. And countries under some form of U.S. sanctions account for nearly 1/5 of global GDP. Sanctions don't just affect the target either. As more sanctions are imposed, all parties must consider the possibility that they or a trading partner will be sanctioned in the future. This incentivizes them to seek alternative currencies and payment systems to hedge against the risk, highlighting a central dilemma of sanctions. The more they are used, the less potent they become. Alternatives to dollar-based payment networks already exist. China launched the Csis cross-border payment system in 2015, which has slowly boosted usage of the renminbi. These are just a few risks to dollar dominance. They may not seem like looming threats right now, but they introduce risk factors which may grow and compound over the next several decades. Fortunately, these are issues that the United States can address. The federal government can promote financial innovation through sound policy and investment, while exercising more discipline on spending and use of financial sanctions. But absent a concerted effort to address these sources of risk, the loss of dollar dominance could follow Hemingway's adage, gradually, then suddenly.